at least through Facebook or something, the valedictorian address given by a young man at Heartland Christian School last week.
It's all this.
Oh, and it's Alquist's grandson, Ryan Hostler.
Neat.
He didn't want to even do it. He asked his dad if he had to. His dad's the school principal. He said, yeah, you kind of do. But what a wonderful expression of encouragement and exhortation to his fellow graduates to continue on with the focus on the Lord and on commitment to Christ. In contrast, we went to the commencement exercises of our grand twins, and throughout the whole procedure, the salutatorian mentioned God. He's thankful to God for being there. Other than that, there was not one mention. Even in what was designated invocation and benediction, which I always thought meant you're invoking God's blessing and you're saying a good word, for a blessing from God, not a mention of God anywhere.
Just another.
It was just another short speech. Altoona, Pennsylvania. And several times people told the students how thankful they should be for all those that helped them through difficult times, COVID and all the rest. Named all kinds of different influences upon their lives, but nary mentioned that God might have had anything to do with anything at all. So really made me thankful for schools like Heartland Christian School, that the whole focus of the whole ceremony was on God. Not wondering whether to be mentioned or not, but if you could watch the whole thing, you'd see them, that the people that are musicians in the class, they're singing praises to God, and the speakers are focusing on God. The singers are singing. So anyway, just thought I'd say that while Brian was getting it set up, and I talked long past that. Well, welcome to our study in the Gospel of Luke, where our focus is on God also, and especially on Jesus Christ. We're in chapter 7. And I know that we have progressed into this event a little ways, most of the way through it maybe, but never wishing to allow a moment of creativity to go without one more shot. The title of this is "The Rain in Nain Comes Plainly to the Main." Okay. So maybe the last time you'll ever have to hear that. But we hope. We could sing it together. The rain in Nain comes plainly to the main. Okay, I guess enough of that. I think everybody was here last week, so we don't need to do a lot of review here, but let's just read the verses, beginning in verse 11. Where it tells us that soon afterwards, Jesus went to a city called Nain, and his disciples were going along with him, accompanied by a large crowd. We're seeing that more and more as we go along here. And now as he approached the gate of the city, a dead man, or one who had died, was being carried out, the only son of his mother, the only begotten, monogenes. And she was a widow on top of that. And a sizable crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord, the first time Luke uses this to describe Jesus, when the Lord saw her, he felt compassion for her and said to her, "Stop weeping." We pointed out last week that there are 3 things that Jesus did in relationship to the widow. He saw her, felt compassion for her, and spoke to her. And certainly that can be a guideline for us too, as we see people in need. First of all, to see them. Sometimes we don't, do we? We pass right by, feel compassion, and then to speak a word of comfort, a word from God. to people that need it. And I think last week we talked about verse 14 where Jesus came up and translations say touched the coffin, or at least mine that says touched the coffin. It was much more than that. He grabbed a hold of the coffin. He stopped it. The procession is moving. There are bearers carrying the bier or bier, which is bier. I always forget bier, I think, carrying the bier. Otherwise, you'd think of something to drink. All right, so carrying the bier. So they're moving along. They only stop when it's time to trade places. And so Jesus got a hold of that. He grabbed it and stopped the procession. He halted the coffin, and the bearers came to a halt. If you stop what's being carried, you're going to stop who's carrying them. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." Now, in looking at the term he uses, young man, that gives us a bit of an idea of the age of this man, but not precisely, because that expression was used in Jewish society for a man up to the age of 40. So most likely the circumstances look like, and the crowd that gathered look like, this man was gainfully employed, was supporting his mother. And as we pointed out before, now she is in dire circumstances because, being a widow, she was dependent on her son, or her children, I should say, to support her, but she's only got one son, and now he's died. And so in relationship to the young man, we also have a progression in relationship by Jesus. First of all, notice Jesus approached the procession. Secondly, he stopped the procession. And then thirdly, he spoke to the young man. Now, the method used by Jesus here in just simply saying to him, calling him by some kind of an appellation, and then I say to you, arise, it contrasts with the prophets that were famous for living in this area, who also were involved in resurrections. Who were they? You recall? Two of the major prophets of the Old Testament, not in writing, but in their presence, who raised people from the dead. Elijah and Elisha. Elijah and Elisha. They had lived in that area, and so people always, to some extent, had them in mind, and so they would naturally contrast what Jesus did here with them, and we'll talk more about that later. But I do want us to compare them here, and we're going to flip back to 1 Kings and 2 Kings, and we'll be going there a little bit later too. But just for right now, let's look at 1 Kings 17:21. 1 Kings 17:21.
Well, they had to do more than just speak the word, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, and so let's look at this. 1 Kings 17:21. And we'll probably read a couple more verses from that as well. Let's see. And that'll be 2 Kings 4. We'll begin with 31 there. All right, first of all, 1 Kings 17:21. Let's read through 24. All right, 21 to 24. We won't get all the background and everything right now. So would someone read verses 21 to 24 of 1 Kings 17?
He stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord and said, "Oh Lord, my God, I pray thee, let this child's soul come into him again." And the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came into him again, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down out of the chamber into the house, and delivered him unto his mother. And Elijah said, See, thy son liveth. And the woman said to Elijah, Now by this I know that thou art a man of God, and the word of the Lord is in thy mouth is true.
Okay, so notice what did Elijah, well, let me ask you this. What's the difference between what Elijah did and what Jesus did?
Elijah had to put forth action by laying on him
Mhm.
and appealing to God, where Jesus just spoke the word.
Yeah.
And Elijah had invoked the name of the Lord.
Mhm. Yeah. Good observation. Yeah. And we already know from the previous event that Jesus doesn't need to even be there to perform a miracle.
Right.
So just saying the word is sufficient as well. So he said, I say to you, arise. Okay, let's flip over to 2 Kings chapter 4. If you found 1 Kings, it's just the next one. Let's see, verse 31. It's kind of in the midst of the story, but to the part we want. Let's read 31 to 35. Someone read that? Okay.
And Gehazi passed on before him and before them, and laid the staff upon the face of the child, but there was neither voice nor hearing. Therefore he went again to meet him and told him, saying, Child is not awake. And when Elisha was come into the house, behold, the child was dead and laid upon his bed. And he went in therefore and shut the door and upon them twain and prayed unto the Lord. And he went up and laid upon the child and put his mouth upon his mouth, and his eyes upon his eyes, and his hand upon his hands. And he stretched himself upon the child, and the flesh of the child waxed warm. 34 or 35?
35.
And then he returned and walked into the house to and fro, and went up and stretched himself upon him. And the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes.
Go read the next verse too.
And he called Gehazi and said, Call this Shunammite. And he called her. So he called her, and when she was coming in unto him, he said, Take up thy son.
Okay, one thing I forgot to point out back in 1 Kings 17. I gotta back and find that again. In verse 23. Okay, it's in the next verse in chapter 7, where it says the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. In 1 Kings 17:23, it says there that Elijah gave him to his mother. And if you read the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the exact same words are used for Elijah as are for Jesus. So again, these people were very steeped in Elijah and Elisha, I'm sure. You know, the people that are from your area or live in your area, these great prophets. And so they would have made a connection there, as what I'm trying to point out. Now, in comparing these three who raised the dead, it may be observed that Elijah raised one. Elisha raised two. There's another one besides this. And Jesus in the Gospels raises 3. Interesting progression. This is the first person that Jesus raised from the dead. Now, if you look at the accounts, he probably raised more than 3. because it says, he was raising people from the dead, but there are three people that are specifically mentioned. All right, any other comments through verse 14?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Well, this is more visual, I think, than when it says the coffin, I'm thinking of a coffin as something enclosed,
Yeah, it's not,
but it was open.
right.
Right?
Coffin's probably not a great translation of that. I think they did a good job here of picturing what it was like. It was more like a wicker stretcher.
Yeah, because they didn't bury him in boxes. They just put him in a cave.
Yeah.
Until their bones became, then they took the bones and they put him in a small box.
Right.
He was gathered to his people.
Yeah, that's right. Called an ossuary. Okay, so New American Standard says coffin. I think that's a little bit misleading. All right, any other questions, comments? Okay, verse 15. The dead man sat up and began to speak. Now, you wouldn't think the words sat up would be that unusual, but in the New Testament, this word is only used here and one other place in Acts 9:40. Interesting. I don't know if it means anything. It is, surprise, a medical term that medical writers often used of the sick sitting up in bed. So Luke uses that same word, a word with which he was very familiar. In fact, in Greek literature outside the Bible, it is used only by medical doctors. So he sat up and began to speak. Now, there may be noises that proceed out of a dead body, but those would not include speech. Don't you wonder what he said?
I was scolded them, why did you bring me back?
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine his surprise? Not knowing what his conscious state was in between. Maybe, I mean, he hadn't died that long before, a matter of hours. Did it seem to him that he awakened from a long nap? And what's he doing on this wicker basket outside the city? And who are all these people around him? You just wonder what he had to say, because Luke points out that he began to speak as an indication that he was truly alive. It wasn't just spasmodic jerks of a dead body.
His mother weeping and
Yeah.
would have been-
Well, of course, Jesus told her to stop weeping, so she's no longer weeping, I suppose, but she's probably speechless as he is speaking. Right. Well, note something. Jesus not only restored the man to life, and we don't often think about this, but he eliminated the causes of his death. I mean, think about that. If you're dead because of some cause. And if you're made alive again without reversing the causes, what's going to happen? Exactly. So it's more than even just bringing life back into a body. It is reversing what caused that death to begin with.
Then you had it down the road, he had to go through another procession anyway.
Yes, that's right. And it says here then that statement, which is exactly as it says of Elijah, Jesus gave him back to his mother. One commentator says the reason that had to be is because he had already ceased to belong to his mother. He died. Jesus is giving her back. Well, what exactly does that mean? Or what did he do? We're not told exactly, but what did Jesus do in giving him back to his mother?
Her heart had to be broken.
Yeah. But my question is, what did he actually do? How did he give the son back to the mother?
It seemed like they physically walk children back to the mother. Here is your child. This is more of a. You now have fellowship with your son again. He's back with you instead of being.
I'm just wondering how physically he demonstrated that.
I think he probably took it by being ad-libbing, but he probably took the guy by his hand. He got him off the litter
Yeah,
and then walked her over, then here's your son.
yeah, I imagine it's something like
It had to
that.
be some kind
He
of-
was sitting up already, so
Yeah.
it'd just be a matter of getting him off and. Or maybe it was drawing her in and said, here's your son. But I think it's good for us to try to imagine those things, just so we get an idea of the personalities, the physical circumstances. And of course, this is very comparable to what Elijah
He
did.
delivered him. So.
Oh, that's right. So that
He
would,
delivered him, so
yeah,
took him by the hand and walked him over there.
yeah.
Here is your son.
Yeah, so what I said about bringing the mother wouldn't work. But, and you can't help but think of what Jesus did for that young man physically is also true of what Jesus does spiritually. You think of John 5:25. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and now is when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Well, that's not only true of a physical resurrection, but it's also true of spiritually what happens. What are we told in the Gospel of John? That he calls our name and we respond to him, to the voice of Jesus in salvation, because he calls us by name. Pastor Brian Bell advises us not to miss the fact that nothing is mentioned about the mother's faith or lack thereof. Nothing is mentioned of any lesson after this to the crowds following him. It wasn't even prompted by the crowds to prove his divinity. It was solely from the well of divine compassion. Someone broken, hurting, weak, frail, moved the heart of God. And as Billy Graham said, the God who has everything wanted me, as he's done that for us spiritually. Interesting that D.L. Moody was asked to conduct a funeral service, so he decided to study the Gospels to find a funeral sermon delivered by Jesus. However, Moody searched in vain, because every funeral Jesus attended, he broke up by raising the dead. And now verse 16. We come to the response of the people. Fear gripped them all. Fear. Lenski says, to see a dead man who is on his way to his tomb raised to life by a word would today strike every one of us with a fear that would make us quake. We need not reduce the word to mean only awe and reverence. He who snatches its prey from the monster death exhibits a power that must make us tremble. And we see the fear expressed here. We can't help but think back to earlier in Luke's gospel of a couple of other occasions when fear is predominant. Look back at chapter 1. You probably know where we're going there. Chapter 1, verse 12. As the very beginning of Luke's gospel has to do with the advent of John the Baptist, which will become very important in the next passage that we go to. Read verse 12 for us, somebody.
Zechariah was shaken and overwhelmed with fear when he saw him.
Okay, when he saw who? If we look back in the context. The angel. Right. So fear in the presence of an angel. And a similar occasion in chapter 2. And let's see, I don't have verse verse 9. Somebody read that for us.
And lo, an angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord showed round about them, and they were very much afraid.
Right. So again, the presence of an angel brings about this fear. And then chapter 5, verse 26. Someone read that for us.
And they were all amazed, and they glorified God and were filled with fear, saying, we have seen strange things today.
Yeah, and what, let's look back and see what was the context there. What had they witnessed? Yeah, the healing of the paralytic. And not only the healing of the paralytic, but what else? What was even more important than the healing of the paralytic? He forgave his sins. And they were struck with astonishment, filled with fear. It says they began glorifying God there. And the same thing that we see here in back in verse 16 of chapter 7, that as a result of this fear, they recognized that the source of what had occurred was God. And it says they began glorifying God. You could translate a word glorifying God, but usually in the imperfect tense in this particular kind of an instances, it indicates the beginning of something. So fear gripped them all. That's the aorist tense, which means looking at basically a point of time or an action as having taken place, and then began glorifying God. Began glorifying God. Again, we saw that back in chapter 2 with the shepherds. In chapter 5 that we just looked at, we saw that with the people that saw the healing of the paralytic. We're going to see it again in chapters 18 and 23, glorifying God. And I hope I'll remember when we get there, although I'll be much older. I don't know if my memory will hold up, but to look back and see the connection between these different places. Glorifying God. Fear gripped them all, glorifying God. Boy, it seems like there's so much that could be said, but I lack the words to do it. Any comments? And then see what their conclusion is. First of all, a great prophet has arisen among us. So what was their evaluation of the situation? And remember, their historical background is Elijah and Elisha, and now they're seeing this man, Jesus, performing a similar miracle as Elijah and Elisha. And so what is their logical conclusion?
Since Malachi, they've been waiting for Elijah to come, preparing.
Yeah.
Preparing a dish and a seat for him that during the Sabbath, during the
Passover.
festivals and stuff. And so they're all anticipating that the fulfillment of scripture that Elijah must come.
And so since Jesus is doing the same kind of thing that Elijah and Elisha did, they say this guy must be a prophet also. And as Joe pointed out, they were starved for a word from God. Although they probably, from what they say, did not make a connection to Deuteronomy 18:15. Yeah, anybody remember what's there?
A man like Moses, one of your own will come in the future.
And not a prophet, but the prophet. The prophet. There's a difference between and the. Most of us even recognize that in English. And they're saying a great prophet has arisen among us, in a line of prophets, one like the other prophets. They fail to recognize, it would appear, the unique position of Jesus as the prophet.
And John the Baptist, had a full knowledge of Isaiah 35, 5 and 6. That the signs of the Messiah.
Yeah.
And then when he got thrown in prison, he started having doubt because he did see how that could fit into all that was being done.
which we'll get to next week. So save that transition for next week. I thought it would be good for us to, even before we go examine further, God has visited his people, then, and we want to spend some time on that. To look at this idea of a great prophet and what they knew and how what the comparisons showed between Elijah, Elisha, and Jesus. A great prophet has appeared among us. So we've already read most of the passage here, and the observations of what occurs concerning Elijah and the raising of this man. The dead person is called the son of the woman. He was sick and then had no breath. Elijah was rebuked by the woman because her son died. Elijah lays the boy on a bed. He calls out to Yahweh. He stretched on the child 3 times. He called out to Yahweh again, and life returned to the boy, and he revived. He gave him to his mother, the same expression again that is used of Jesus, and the woman responds with faith. Now, we didn't read as much of the passage in 2 Kings of Elisha, but here's what happens there. In this case, the child was grown. The circumstances seem to indicate heat stroke. Again, Elisha was rebuked for the death of this son. He was laid on the bed of Elisha by the mother, who then shut the door and went out. The mother called to her husband so she could go to Elisha at Mount Carmel. Oops, I think there's an extra letter in there. And she replied that all was well. So what does that tell us about this woman? She had faith that something would occur, even though she rebuked Elisha. Then Gehazi, Elisha's servant, was sent by him to lay a staff on the child's face. Similar to Elijah, only not the body of Elisha, but just his staff. And that apparently had no effect. After what happens below, that is, he entered, shut the door, and prayed to Yahweh. He then laid on the child, mouth to mouth, eye to eye, hand to hand. Again, similar to Elijah, but more specific. And only once, not 3 times. Then the flesh became warm. We're given that extra description. Sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. So much more descriptive than Elijah. And this time, I think he gave him to his mother, but with words, take up your son. And the mother fell at Elisha's feet and bowed to the ground.
Elijah had twice as many miracles as Elijah did. If we can question.
Yeah, that's right. And it's an interesting study to look at the miracles of Elijah and Elisha and compare them, just like the same thing in the book of Acts between Peter and Paul. But we shan't get sidetracked there. Jesus, he's a dead man, the only son of his mother. She was a widow. It's unknown what caused his death. Whereas Elijah and Elisha were rebuked because they had been instrumental in the woman having a son. Jesus isn't even solicited here. No one seems to even know who he is from this procession. Instead of laying him on a bed, he simply stops the procession. And instead of, and this is a significant thing, I think one of you mentioned this, instead of calling out to Yahweh, he simply said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And instead of the descriptiveness of Elisha especially, we find that the young man sat up and began to speak. No sneezing here. And he gave him back to his mother. And the response in Elijah and Elisha is somewhat limited to the mother. But here we have 2 crowds. one that had been with the funeral procession, and one had coming with Jesus. And everybody in those two crowds feared and glorified God. Any comments about the comparisons? Yeah, Jim.
The ones where they laid on bodies. You know, sticks in my mind. And this one was so positive, it was already wrapped. You know, we put into the, wherever they're gonna put it.
Yeah.
But it seems so much more definite. You know, and then just
Mhm.
speed.
Whereas the mothers were attempting to bring life to their child, the prophet. This mother has no conception of that. She's expecting the boy to be put in the tomb.
All over.
Yeah,
There certainly shouldn't have been a waiting period too. You know, they didn't do it immediately. They kept praying and believing that the spirit would come back into the, that's why Lazarus was waited 4 days, because that eliminated that potential allegation that he never really died to begin with.
yeah. Although that's true, they believe the spirit hovered there. They still put them in the tomb the same day. So this young man would have died that day. Probably after Jesus left Capernaum.
It just shows that Jesus is God.
Yep.
There's- he didn't make it
Luke just
all-
keeps adding more and more evidence, doesn't he, as we go along? Well, it looks like we'll come back next week to look at the expression God has visited his people. This is a very significant statement. It is made by these people. They understand something here. We're going to look at it. And then we're going to go on to the passage that Joe was trying to take us into earlier, and we'll let him do it next week, looking at John the Baptist and his doubts, and see what we have to learn from there. Any final comments? Don't forget to turn into YCTV, watch some of the great programs on there, including one I heard about that you might enjoy, Discovering His Story or History.
Yeah.
I heard that it was great. That's what's